Well, you think it's late for you? It's 3:30 in the morning here. Just the other day in Jakarta, we were closing the show to the sounds of prayer. Tonight, we end the show with the sun rising like thunder across the bay. It's a remarkable thing that the wonders of a mom-and-pop sun show can come to you live all the way from Bali. I hope you'll agree. I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas and are looking forward to a peaceful, prosperous, and healthy new year. I find myself increasingly saying that this may not be the most important news story of the day, but for someone of my age and gender, the death of Brigitte Bardot marked the end of an era. In the 1960s, she was the most ravishingly beautiful woman in the world. You might not have wanted to take her home to meet your mother, and marrying her may not have been wise, but she truly was emblematic of a France that oozed sensuality and style. This was the era of Brigitte Bardot and Alain Delon, someone to whom I was briefly compared. She even came to Scotland in 1966, to the sands of Gullen near North Berwick, where I worked for a month during what became the famous North Berwick by-election in East Lothian. The SNP nearly won what had been a rock-solid Labour seat held by John P. Mackintosh, a great Labour intellectual of the time. I remember that period for many reasons, not just because I was courting on the same sands once walked by Bardot, but because the Iranian Revolution began that very month. I remember the Labour Foreign Secretary condemning the people of Iran for rising up against Britain's favoured ruler at the time, the Shah of Persia. I remember thinking how strange it was for a Labour Foreign Secretary to back a despotic Shah against a people's revolution. Later, I learned that this is often what Labour foreign ministers do in times of trouble. Beware of geeks bearing gifts, and you don't get more geeky than John Healey, the current British Defence Secretary. Healey is trying to entice students to take a gap year, not in Bali, as once might have been the case, but in the British Army. If those students are educated at all, if they had the brains to reach university in the first place, they'll blow a huge raspberry at the chief geek, John Healey, the so-called war minister in another so-called Labour government. The big story tonight, however, is unfolding on very different sands, not Gullen and certainly not Bali, but the beaches of Florida. Mar-a-Lago, the so-called summer White House, is where Donald Trump spends much of the year, playing golf daily despite the bone spurs that kept him out of the Vietnam War and earned him 7 deferments. I've been looking at the paddies around here recently, magnificent sights, but not places you'd want to dive face down for the American empire. At Mar-a-Lago right now sits Zelensky, having stopped briefly, but profitably, in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Why Halifax? Why does he stop anywhere? Because he arrived with his bag open and left with another $3 billion. The money came from Mark Carney, the man who once ran the Bank of England and is now Prime Minister of Canada, though Trump calls him the Governor of Canada, a state he jokes about annexing. This handout came despite Canada running a record public sector deficit, despite millions of Canadians being food insecure, despite rampant homelessness and people freezing in homes they cannot afford to heat. There is always money when Zelensky comes to town. This happens even as Ukrainian anti-corruption agencies close in on senior officials in Kiev, corruption creeping ever closer to Zelensky himself. Hunter Biden himself admitted that corruption in Ukraine was frightening and that he was foolish, but extremely well paid, to work there. The allure of Burisma was irresistible, not just to him but to his father, then Vice President of the United States. And so, as investigations narrow in on billions in euros, dollars, and pounds, Mark Carney handed more billions to Zelensky, who then flew on to Mar-a-Lago. I don't want to be churlish. I want this war to end as much as anyone. But the mood music is troubling. Trump sounds bullish, like a man with a Nobel Peace Prize on his mind. He's saying the time has come for peace. He spoke warmly with Vladimir Putin for an hour and a half before Zelensky even arrived, and now claims Zelensky is also interested in peace. We'll see. Zelensky's habitual caveats tend to be deal-breakers. Still, this situation reflects how badly the war is going for his regime and its NATO backers. This bloody conflict has killed millions, displaced 9 million Ukrainians, and brought devastation unseen in Europe since World War II, a war that should never have begun back in 2014. We must remember the Minsk agreements. I was recently in Minsk and fully understand the damage done by their deliberate sabotage. Angela Merkel and François Hollande later admitted the agreements were never meant to work, only to buy time to arm Ukraine for a second phase. We must also remember the Istanbul Agreement, signed early in the conflict, which could have ended the war before it truly began, but was scuppered by Boris Johnson. The Alaska formula agreed between Trump and Putin should now be used to end this conflict. If Trump succeeds, I'll be the first to tip my hat to him. If talks fail, however, Russia will go all the way, possibly even to Kiev, until a neutral government is installed. That is the cost of ignoring diplomacy. As dawn approaches, I'll briefly mention Somaliland. This so-called entity is a fiction, only one country recognizes it, Israel. A glance at the map explains why. Control of these waterways would shift global power. Israel has just taken control of Berbera Air Base, giving it easy access to Yemen and potentially Iran. Some suggest Gaza's population could be deported there, but that would fail spectacularly. No Arab country, no African nation, and no part of the global south would recognize such a move. If anything, an international force would soon reassert Somalia's sovereignty. I'm not sure how long I've been speaking, we started at an unauthorized hour, for which I apologize. But we have two great guests coming up, including Lieutenant Colonel Aguilar, an American officer and hero of Gaza. He'll be discussing all of this.